Say goodbye to everything, my daughter-in-law sneered as her hands pressed hard against my back. I had only a second to register her twisted smile before I felt myself falling, air rushing, rocks looming. My son Mark stood a few feet away, watching with a cold stillness that tore through me deeper than the jagged cliff below. They thought the fall would end me, clearing their path to the $2 billion fortune I had built with sweat, sacrifice, and a lifetime of unrelenting discipline. But death didn't claim me that morning. And when they lifted their champagne glasses later that night, celebrating what they believed was my demise, the FBI walked through their front door, and I was right behind them. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. The truth is, betrayal has many faces. Sometimes it comes in whispers, sometimes in contracts, and sometimes, in the cruelest twist of all, it comes in the form of family, the very people you nurtured and trusted. For me, it was my son Mark and his wife, Rachel. I should have noticed the cracks long before that day on the cliff. The glances exchanged at the dinner table, the way Rachel lingered too long in my office when she thought I wasn't looking, Mark's sharp questions about account access, estate transfers, and timelines. I told myself they were curious, maybe even ambitious. What I didn't want to admit was that they were circling me like vultures, waiting for the right moment to strike. Let me take you back a little. My name is Margaret Ellis. I am 78 years old. I grew up in a one-bedroom house in Ohio, raised by parents who had little more than determination in their pockets. I built my empire from the ground up, real estate, shipping, and later, clean energy investments. People told me I was too old to take risks, too stubborn to listen. They weren't wrong about the stubborn part. That stubbornness is the reason I turned $15,000 into billions. But money, as I would learn, doesn't always buy loyalty. When my husband Robert died 15 years ago, I thought I had at least one constant, my son. Mark was the only child I had, and I poured into him every lesson, every ounce of love, every chance I could. Rachel entered his life not long after. At first, I welcomed her. She was beautiful, sharp, ambitious. She talked about family values, about carrying on traditions. But beneath the gloss, there was something cold about her. She never asked me about Robert, never looked at the framed pictures that lined our hallway. Her eyes always seemed to skip past the memories and land on the material, the silver, the paintings, the locked cabinets. For years, I brushed off the unease. They were young. They wanted to make their mark. I gave them space, even supported them with seed money for their ventures. But entitlement is a beast that grows with feeding. The more I gave, the more they demanded. Mark especially. He would remind me of my age, as though time itself was an argument for surrender. "Mom, you can't take it with you," he would joke. At first, I laughed. Later, I realized he wasn't joking. That morning at the cliff wasn't an accident, nor a moment of madness. It was planned. Rachel suggested the hike. "Fresh air will do us all good," she said, her smile practiced and warm. I had no reason to doubt her, not openly. We drove together to the trail, the sky painted a pale blue, the air cool with autumn. Rachel walked beside me, chatting about their plans for renovations, travel, futures. Mark walked just behind, his silence unsettling. And then, as we reached the overlook, a jagged edge where the valley stretched endlessly below, Rachel's hand came fast, firm, final. The world tilted. My heart stopped. And then, I fell. But what they hadn't counted on was preparation. I've lived too long, trusted too little, and seen enough to know that greed makes people reckless. For weeks, I had been working quietly with my attorneys, my financial team, and yes, the FBI. Their questions about my accounts, their late-night whispers, the failed attempts to access restricted files, those weren't invisible to me. They left trails, digital fingerprints, patterns only a fool would ignore. I wasn't a fool. What they didn't know was that I had arranged a meeting with an FBI agent 2 days before that hike. I had already handed over recordings, emails, and even footage from security cameras. They were already under investigation for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted financial theft. My fall, literal and metaphorical, was their mistake. As my body hurtled downward, instinct took over. I grabbed at the outcropping of rock. Pain shot through my arm as I slammed into a ledge barely wide enough to stop me. The world spun, but I was alive. My body ached, my palms bled, my shoulder screamed, but I was breathing. And with that breath came fire. I refused to die, not like that, not by their hands. By some miracle, or maybe sheer willpower, I found a path down the side. Branch by branch, rock by rock, I lowered myself until I reached the bottom. A hiker found me hours later, bloodied but conscious. They called for help. At the hospital, as doctors patched me up, I told the FBI agent everything. Every suspicion. Every betrayal. Every attempt they had made to corner me into signing over power of attorney. And when I finished, the agent simply said, "We'll be ready." And ready they were. That night, Mark and Rachel toasted with champagne in my dining room, their laughter echoing off the very walls Robert and I had built with love. They believed my fortune, my legacy, and my silence were all theirs. But when the knock came at the door, followed by the unmistakable sound of authority, the FBI stepping inside, they froze. Rachel's glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the hardwood floor. Mark's face drained of color. And then, as if fate itself demanded justice, I stepped inside behind the agents, standing taller than I had in years. The look on their faces, shock, disbelief, fear, was the proof I needed. They hadn't just tried to kill me. They had underestimated me. And that, my dear viewers, was their biggest mistake. Rachel's face crumpled the moment our eyes locked. For a flicker of a second, I saw not triumph or control but fear, the kind of fear only guilt can conjure. Mark, on the other hand, didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, his champagne glass still raised halfway, his lips twitching into the faintest sneer. My son. The child I carried for 9 months, raised with lullabies and prayers, now sitting there as though he had done nothing wrong, as though pushing his own mother toward death was simply business strategy. The FBI agents didn't waste time. 2 of them moved forward, their voices firm and rehearsed. Mark Ellis, Rachel Ellis, you're under investigation for conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted financial exploitation, and suspected attempted homicide. Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Mark scoffed. This is insane. My mother's confused. She's old, she's fragile, she doesn't know what she's saying. I stepped forward, my hand still bandaged from gripping those jagged rocks. My voice cut through the room sharper than any knife. Confused? Fragile? I crawled out of that canyon with bones that held stronger than your loyalty ever did. Don't you dare paint me as weak. Rachel whispered, but we saw. She stopped, realizing her words betrayed her. She saw me fall, saw me disappear, assumed death had done the rest. But death and I aren't strangers. I've stared at it before, at my husband's bedside, at my parents' funerals, at wars and recessions that threatened to ruin me. I know how to survive. And I know how to fight. The agents began collecting documents from the table, Rachel's folder, Mark's scattered notes. One agent handed me a copy. We've been monitoring them for weeks, Mrs. Ellis, he said quietly. We just needed confirmation. That confirmation had come in the form of their arrogance. People who believe themselves untouchable always leave fingerprints. Their fingerprints were all over forged loan applications, offshore account transfers, and emails Rachel thought she had deleted but hadn't. I watched them as they were questioned, their denials stumbling into contradictions. Rachel's composure cracked fast. Her voice rose, shrill and desperate. It was Mark's idea. He told me to. Mark's head snapped toward her, his face reddening. Don't you dare pin this on me, Rachel. You were the one who pushed her. So there it was, spoken aloud in my own dining room, the confession I hadn't even needed to force. Their words tangled into knots, and I stood silent, letting them dig their graves. The FBI didn't arrest them that night, not yet. This was bigger than one push, one moment. They wanted everything, the fraud, the conspiracy, the attempt on my life tied neatly together. But they left enough warning. Papers were signed, warrants granted, and protective measures placed around me. Mark and Rachel weren't leaving the city without tripping alarms. After they left, I stood alone in my house. The silence felt heavier than ever. My husband's portrait on the mantel seemed to watch me, his eyes steady, his smile frozen in time. Robert, I whispered, my throat tightening, we raised a son who forgot what love is. But I'll remind him what justice feels like. The next morning Blake, my lawyer and closest ally, arrived. He set his briefcase on the table and leaned in. Margaret, it's time we get ahead of this. They're not just after your money. They want your name, your power, your legacy. We need to show the world the truth. We spent hours drafting statements, securing documents, freezing accounts they had tried to touch. Blake was meticulous, flipping through files like a surgeon preparing instruments. The trust is already ironclad, he said. But now, we fortify it with evidence. Every transfer they attempted, every forgery, every time they tried to corner you. We'll hand the prosecutors a case so solid it'll crush them. That week, I learned how betrayal spreads like rot. Neighbors I'd known for decades avoided my eyes at the grocery store. Old friends called with hesitant voices, saying they'd heard rumors, that I was losing my mind, that I'd made wild accusations, that perhaps I should step down from managing my estate. It was Mark and Rachel, whispering poison into every ear that would listen. They painted me as unstable, a paranoid old woman clinging to money she didn't need. They forgot, however, that while rumors are wind, proof is stone. I placed cameras not only inside the house but also at the office they frequented. With Blake's help, we hired a private investigator, an old friend of his named Carl. Carl was rough around the edges, with a graying beard and sharp eyes. He had a way of blending into crowds, of making people talk. Within days, he uncovered meetings Mark and Rachel had with shady investors, conversations where they boasted that soon the Ellis fortune would be theirs. Every detail was documented, time-stamped, stored in triplicate. But betrayal doesn't just wound, it awakens. I felt a fire inside me I hadn't felt since my early years in business, when every deal was a fight, every success a battle hard won. Mark and Rachel thought age had dulled me. They were wrong. Age had sharpened me, honed me, tempered me. A week after the cliff, Rachel dared to show her face again. She came alone, carrying a tray of muffins like she was some sweet neighbor. I opened the door and looked her in the eye. "Margaret," she began, her voice syrupy, "I know things have been tense. But I think we can work this out. I brought these, your favorite blueberry." I didn't touch the tray. "Did you think baked goods would erase blood?" I asked, my voice cold. Her mask cracked, just for a second. "You have no proof," she whispered. I smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. "Don't I?" I closed the door in her face. Behind me, the red light of the camera blinked quietly, recording every second. That night, as I reviewed the footage, I felt something I hadn't in weeks: control. They thought they had stripped me of power when they pushed me off that cliff. But in truth, they had handed me the final weapon, undeniable evidence of their greed, their cruelty, their stupidity. The FBI called 2 days later. "We're ready," the agent said. So was I. Because this wasn't just about defending myself anymore. This was about teaching my son and his wife that no amount of money justifies betrayal. They wanted my empire? They'd face it head-on, in court under oath, with the weight of justice pressing on their shoulders. And when it was over, they'd see me not as the fragile old woman they tried to kill, but as the survivor who refused to break. Courtrooms have their own kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind that comes from a chapel or a quiet morning in a garden. No, it's the heavy silence of expectation, of judgment, of truth waiting to drop like a hammer. That's the silence I walked into on the morning of the preliminary hearing, my cane tapping against the polished floor, the FBI agents at my side. Mark and Rachel were already there, sitting stiffly at the defense table. Rachel wore a sleek black suit, her hair pulled into a tight bun, her expression a careful mask of poise. Mark wore a navy jacket over a white shirt, his posture defiant, chin lifted too high. When his eyes met mine, I searched for even a flicker of shame. I found none. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair, called the session to order. Prosecutors laid out the charges: attempted homicide, conspiracy to commit fraud, financial exploitation of an elder. Each word felt like a stone laid on the scales of justice. Rachel shifted uncomfortably with every accusation, but Mark just leaned back in his chair, lips twitching like he was still winning. Then it was my turn. I rose slowly, steadying myself with my cane. The room seemed to shrink as I spoke, my voice not loud but steady, each word chosen like a weapon. I told them everything: the hike, the shove, the fall, the blood on my hands as I clawed at the cliffside to survive. I spoke of Rachel's cold eyes, of Mark's silence, of the champagne toasts they thought would be my epitaph. Rachel shook her head, whispering furiously to her lawyer. Mark scoffed, muttering, "She's exaggerating." But the judge silenced him with a sharp rap of her gavel. Then the FBI presented the recordings. The emails. The fake loan applications. The conversations Carl had captured between Mark and Rachel, bragging about how they'd soon control the Ellis empire. And most damning of all, the footage from my home camera, Rachel standing on my porch, muffins in hand, whispering, "You have no proof." The jury of onlookers, neighbors, reporters, curious strangers, shifted in their seats. I saw one of my longtime neighbors cover her mouth in shock. Another shook her head in disbelief. The lies that Mark and Rachel had spread in the community began to wither right there, exposed to the disinfecting light of truth. But it wasn't just the facts that mattered. It was the betrayal. I made sure they understood that. "This isn't about money," I said, my voice trembling not with weakness but with fury. "I've had money. I've lost money. I know it comes and goes. This is about family. About trust. About the son I raised who laughed while his wife tried to kill me." The silence after those words was deafening. Even Rachel lowered her head. Mark just stared at me, his jaw tight, fists clenched. The defense tried to counter, of course. Their lawyer painted me as controlling, manipulative, unwilling to pass on the family wealth. He suggested I had slipped on the trail, that my injuries were accidents, that stress and grief had made me paranoid. He said my cameras and recordings were taken out of context. But context was on my side. The FBI had dates, timestamps, signatures. They had Rachel's own voice, her own words. They had Mark's digital fingerprints on fraudulent transfers. Context wasn't missing, it was damning. When the session adjourned, the air outside the courthouse was thick with whispers. Reporters thrust microphones at me, shouting questions. "Mrs. Ellis, how do you feel? Do you believe your son will be convicted? What will happen to the $2 billion estate?" I raised my chin, my voice calm. "Justice will happen. Whatever form it takes, justice will happen." That night, exhaustion weighed heavy on me, but I couldn't sleep. I sat in my study, staring at the old family portrait on the mantel. Mark was 12 in that picture, grinning with a baseball glove too big for his hand. Robert had his arm around my shoulders, pride shining in his eyes. I touched the glass, whispering, "What happened to him, Robert? How did he become this?" But the truth was, Mark had chosen his path. And now, he'd have to walk it to the end. Over the following weeks, the investigation deepened. More evidence surfaced, secret accounts overseas, recorded phone calls where Rachel begged a banker to push it through, witnesses who saw Mark meeting with men known for laundering money. Piece by piece, the puzzle became a trap they couldn't escape. And still they tried. Rachel filed motions to dismiss. Mark smirked through depositions, claiming I was delusional. Their arrogance was a mask for panic, and every time it slipped, prosecutors pounced. Through it all, I kept my spiral notebook, jotting down every detail, every slight, every whispered threat from years before that now made sense. That notebook became my anchor, proof that my memory was sharp, my will unbroken. Then came the day Rachel broke. During a closed-door meeting with prosecutors, she confessed, half a confession, half a plea bargain. She admitted to pushing me, admitted to plotting with Mark. But she painted herself as the victim, claiming Mark had manipulated her, that he had promised her the world if she just helped him a little. When word reached me, I felt no triumph. Only sorrow. Sorrow that my son had dragged her down with him. But sorrow doesn't erase justice. Blake came to me with the news, his face serious. "Rachel's turning on Mark. This will seal it." I nodded slowly. "Then let it be sealed." The trial was set. The world would watch. My family's betrayal would no longer be whispers or rumors, it would be history, written in court records and headlines. As I lay in bed that night, the weight of it all pressing on my chest, I whispered a prayer. Not for Mark, not for Rachel. For myself. For the strength to stand tall when the storm broke, for the courage to look my son in the eyes and not flinch when the final judgment came. Because no matter what happened next, I knew one thing, I was still standing. And that was something they could never take from me. The trial opened like a stage play, grand, tense, and merciless. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, reporters shoulder to shoulder, cameras clicking outside the doors. The world wanted to see how far greed could twist a family, and I was at the center of it. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my cane resting against my chair, my hands folded neatly over the spiral notebook I carried everywhere. Across the room, Mark and Rachel sat side by side at the defense table, but the distance between them was colder than ice. Rachel's betrayal, her half-confession, her deal with prosecutors, hung like a knife between them. She barely looked at him. He, in turn, glared at her with the fury of a man who realized too late that loyalty can't be bought. The judge entered, her gavel striking once. Court is now in session. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted the picture with the precision of an artist who knew exactly which colors would wound the deepest. They spoke of my empire, how it had been built through decades of work, how it had become a fortune of $2 billion, and how greed had eaten at the very people who should have honored it. They described Rachel's shove, Mark's silence, the fraudulent accounts, the loan applications, the offshore transfers. Every detail was laid bare. Then, it was my turn to testify. I rose slowly, every eye in the room on me, and walked to the witness stand. The clerk swore me in, and I sat down, adjusting the microphone. My throat felt dry, but when I opened my mouth, my voice carried with the weight of every betrayal and every ounce of strength that had kept me alive. I am Margaret Ellis, I began, 78 years old. Mother. Widow. Businesswoman. Survivor. I let the word hang there. And I am here because my son and his wife tried to kill me for money. Rachel flinched. Mark didn't blink. I told them everything, again. From the morning hike, Rachel's hand pushing me into the void, to clawing my way down the cliffside, to waking in the hospital with blood crusted on my palms. I described the champagne glasses, the laughter, the smug certainty that I was gone. And then I told them about the FBI. About the emails. About the cameras. About Rachel's own words on my porch, "You have no proof." My jaw still ached as I spoke, a dull throb that reminded me of the moment my world cracked in two. But pain sharpened me. It made every word hit harder. When the defense attorney rose to cross-examine me, his tone was almost mocking. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, "isn't it true that you've been forgetful in recent years? That your memory isn't quite what it used to be?" I looked him dead in the eye. I remember the exact sound of my jaw breaking when your client's wife struck me. I remember the feel of the rock under my fingers when I clung for my life. My memory is clear, sir. Perhaps clearer than it's ever been. The courtroom murmured. The judge banged her gavel for silence. The attorney pressed harder. "Isn't it true that you refused to share your fortune with your family? That your son was only trying to secure his rightful inheritance?" I leaned forward, my voice steady. An inheritance is not a right. It is a gift. And no gift is earned by betrayal. For the first time, Mark's composure cracked. He shifted in his chair, jaw tightening, eyes narrowing at me. The boy I had once rocked to sleep was gone, replaced by a man whose hunger had hollowed him out. Then came Rachel's testimony. She took the stand, her voice trembling but rehearsed. She admitted to pushing me. She admitted to planning with Mark. But she painted herself as manipulated, as though she were merely a puppet on his string. "He told me it was the only way," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "He said his mother was old, stubborn, and that she would never willingly let go of the house or the money. I thought it was the only way forward." Mark exploded. He slammed his fist on the table. "Liar," he shouted, his face red, veins bulging at his temples. "You were the one who wanted it. You were the one who said." "Mr. Ellis," the judge barked, her gavel striking, "you will control yourself." But it was too late. The jury had seen his mask crack. They had seen the rage, the greed, the lack of remorse. His outburst did what no evidence could, it showed his true face. The FBI agents followed with their testimony. They laid out the forged documents, the digital trails, the secret accounts. Carl, the private investigator, took the stand too, describing the meetings he had recorded, the boasts Mark had made to shady investors. Piece by piece, the mountain of evidence grew until it towered above the defense like an avalanche waiting to fall. By the end of the week, the case was no longer just strong, it was unbreakable. I sat in the gallery each day, notebook in hand, jotting down everything. My lawyer, Blake, leaned over once and whispered, "You're winning, Margaret." But I shook my head. This wasn't about winning. It was about surviving. About reclaiming the dignity they tried to steal. When closing arguments came, the prosecution spoke with fire. "This is not just a case of greed," the attorney said. "It is a case of betrayal so profound it shakes the very foundation of family. Mrs. Ellis built a legacy, not just in money but in values. And her own son chose to destroy it for profit." The defense tried their best, painting me as controlling, painting Rachel as desperate, painting Mark as misunderstood. But their words rang hollow. The judge adjourned, announcing the jury would return with their verdict the following week. That night, I sat alone in my garden, the moonlight silver on the roses Robert had planted decades ago. My body was tired, my bones aching, but my spirit felt unyielding. I whispered into the night, "Robert, tomorrow they'll know. They'll know what we built was stronger than their betrayal." And in that silence, I felt peace. But peace, like silence, never lasts long. Because the next morning, as I stepped onto my porch, I found an envelope tucked under the mat. No name, no return address. Just one line scrolled across the paper. "This isn't over." The envelope burned in my hands. "This isn't over." For words scrawled in messy ink, like a last gasp from a drowning man. I turned it over twice, checking for fingerprints, smudges, anything. Nothing. Whoever left it had been careful. But I didn't need a detective to guess where it came from. Mark. The boy I raised, the man who'd turned greed into his compass. Even as the trial closed in around him, even as Rachel shifted sides and confessed, he clung to arrogance like it was oxygen. That note was his last attempt to rattle me. But I wasn't rattled. I was ready. The final day of court dawned cold and gray, clouds heavy above the courthouse. Reporters swarmed outside, microphones thrust like weapons. "Mrs. Ellis, are you afraid? Do you think your son will be convicted? What will happen to the $2 billion fortune?" I walked past them without a word, my cane steady on the stone steps, Blake by my side. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. The jury filed in, 12 solemn faces carrying the weight of judgment. The judge asked the foreman if they had reached a verdict. They had. The foreman, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, rose. His voice was calm but clear as he read, "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of attempted financial exploitation, guilty. On the charge of attempted homicide, we find the defendant Rachel Ellis guilty. On the charge of complicity in attempted homicide, we find the defendant Mark Ellis guilty." The words landed like stones in water, rippling through the courtroom. Rachel let out a strangled sob, collapsing into her lawyer's arms. Mark's face twisted, red with fury. He shot to his feet shouting, "This is a setup. She's lying. She's old, she's vindictive, she's..." The judge's gavel cracked down. "Order. Sit down, Mr. Ellis." But he didn't sit. He turned to me, eyes blazing. "You'll regret this, Mom. Do you hear me? You'll regret it." 2 bailiffs moved quickly, restraining him, forcing him back into his chair. His voice echoed in the courtroom, but for the first time, no one listened. The judge's tone was iron. "You have betrayed your mother, your family, and the law. You will face sentencing in due time. Until then, you are remanded into custody." The gavel struck again. It was over. Or rather, it was finished for them. For me, it was the beginning of something else. I walked slowly out of the courtroom, the press surging forward. Cameras flashed, voices shouted, but all I felt was the cool air on my skin, the weight lifting off my shoulders. I had stood face to face with betrayal and survived. I had turned their cruelty into their undoing. That night, I returned to my house, not to mourn, but to reclaim it. The walls that had once echoed with my son's laughter and later his scheming now felt quiet, still mine again. I walked room to room, touching the furniture, the photographs, the life I had built with Robert. In the kitchen, I poured myself a cup of tea. My jaw still ached when I chewed, a reminder of Rachel's violence, but it no longer felt like weakness. It was proof. Proof that I had survived what was meant to end me. Rosa came over, her eyes wet with relief. "You did it," she whispered. I shook my head. "No. We did it. Every neighbor who stood by me. Every friend who believed me. Blake, the FBI, you. I wasn't alone, Rosa. Not really." She smiled softly. "And now?" Now, I said, staring out the window at Robert's roses blooming in the garden, I make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. In the weeks that followed, I set up a foundation. The Ellis Trust for Justice. Its purpose: to protect elders from exploitation, to provide legal aid for those who had no one to fight for them. My $2 billion fortune, the fortune they had tried to steal, became the very shield that would guard others. The newspapers wrote about it. From betrayal to justice, Margaret Ellis turns fortune into shield. The neighbors who once whispered rumors now stopped me on the street to offer hugs, apologies, gratitude. But I didn't need their words. I had my own peace. As for Mark and Rachel, the last I saw of them was in chains, led away by marshals. Rachel's eyes were hollow, drained of the arrogance she once wore like perfume. Mark's face was still twisted in rage, shouting promises of revenge that no one took seriously. I didn't hate them. Hate is heavy, and I'd carried enough weight. I pitied them. They had traded love for greed, family for fortune, and ended with nothing. One evening, I sat in my armchair, the same one I had envisioned in my mind as I dangled from that cliff. The fire crackled softly. My tea steamed in its cup. And for the first time in years, I felt whole. I thought about Robert, about the promise we'd made to build something lasting. And I realized, we had. Not just the money, not just the house, but the lesson. That dignity, truth, and resilience outlast betrayal. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and whispered into the quiet, I survived. And I won. The house seemed to breathe with me, a long exhale of relief. And I knew deep in my bones that my story wasn't just mine. It belonged to every person who had ever been betrayed, dismissed, or underestimated. It was proof that even at 78, with scars and broken bones, you can rise. That is my legacy. Not the billions. Not the empire. But the strength to stand when family tries to push you over the edge, and to walk back through the door stronger than before.